Welcome in, everybody. Welcome back. The Archives Book Club, episode 7. I am very excited to be here with my buddy Adraseth.
It's like a new year, literally a new year for us. We're doing this in 2020 and we haven't had an episode in a while. And some of you may not recognize the non-bearded, non-beanie capped version of Adraseth, but here I am. Happy to do the Archives Book Club, episode 7, recap edition, going over some of our old stuff. Actually, I think really what this is getting caught up where we had to cut the episode short because we kept talking about all this cool stuff we've learned over the last 6 episodes. So we're going to do a real fun summary of all sorts of cool stuff that we've talked about and thought about, especially in the last 6 to 8 months since the last time we've actually been on the show together.
Yeah, I mean, when I thought about it, it really is like a greatest hits episode, right? It's we felt the need to recap these whole books, right? And there are, of course, lots of ideas in them, but then you don't really get to spend the time on like, okay, what are those one or two like key points that are actually like the most applicable thing to StarCraft that we can take from this? And it feels like, I mean, I really could rant about these each for like a whole episode. And we may do some deeper dives on stuff, but I think recapping is a really good way to kind of like restart the show now that I'm kind of moved into the new place and things are kind of settled a little more.
Right. And I think also because there's been such a big gap from when we were doing this, we were on a schedule of about 1 episode per month, which we're going to try and restart that same schedule for everybody who's a old time listener coming back. There's been a big gap since we've talked about learning, just between Arid and I. We talk often, but we haven't talked about these learning concepts and these ideas. And both of us have progressed in our StarCraft play in different ways. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to have this, renewed perspective, this hindsight going back on these books. So I'm really looking forward to like covering these topics because I remember even digging up my old notes about these books. I thought, maybe I think about this differently now in the context of my current gameplay and where I'm at in the game now.
Yeah, for me, some of them I was like, oh yeah, that's why I do this, right? It was like kind of a reaffirmation, and then some of them I was like, shit, I totally forgot about that point entirely, and I need to work this back in. So it was actually really good for me to do the review as well in that way.
Right. Yeah, that's another thing is that, then over the last week I was kind of working on my notes and I was streaming StarCraft a few days and I thought, oh yeah, I forgot these concepts. Maybe I should implement them, rather than rage quit at the end of a game. I should probably implement some of these learning techniques again into my play. And it was a good refresher. It's a good reminder. And it goes to show you how much we learn. But then if you're not, actively doing these things, you start forgetting. And it's a little bit like a college course. You go in there and you get all the knowledge, you pass the test, and you're like, good, don't have to think about that again. But really, these are like lifelong lessons. I'm glad we're going back and revisiting a lot of these things. It's definitely going to help. I think it helps me. I think it will definitely help some of our viewers who are still thinking about learning, thinking about StarCraft in this, specific way, scientific minded way, and trying to improve.
Yeah, I think that really is like the core motivation, right? Whether you're somebody like me where, you have really limited time to get good at StarCraft, and so you gotta like try to, squeeze the most out of that you can, or if you're somebody who's just grinding a ton, right? You're dumping hours and hours and hours, and like either way, you want to be efficient with that, right? Like if I told you you can get 200 MMR or 100 MMR out of X hours of practice, like which one do you pick, right? That's very simple. And I think it's one of those things where it can be very tempting to be like, well, yeah, but doing anything other than like pressing the next game button is like not gonna progress me. And I think that's a little bit of a false concept.
Right. And this is, this comes back to historically how StarCraft as a game developed and how kids really, when you think about Broodware, people playing that were kids who weren't adults that were practicing it, how they approached the learning aspect of the game and how much more we know now in 2020 about cognitive psychology, about learning, how the brain operates, neuroscience. All these things have come together to improve the way that humans learn new tasks. And so it's something that, if you think back to, especially you look, I remember doing this, looking back in like Team Liquid's forums and
Mm,
Brood War advice on how to get better at StarCraft. A lot of it is like, well, you load up your custom game and play it, and then load up another one and you play that, and then do a third, and you just keep getting better. You go by the metric of when you max out or something.
mhm,
But the reality is there's so many other ways that you can learn that are probably more efficient.
mhm.
And we're going to cover a lot of those today and revisit some of the concepts of how to be really efficient in your learning. And maybe we should just jump right into it, huh?
Yeah, yeah, let's do it. So, we're gonna be going in order today. So for past viewers and listeners, if you have whether you've tracked all the episodes or maybe you missed one, you can kind of follow along book by book here. So our first book here, Inner Game of Tennis, episode 1. My big point, the thing that I took away from this more than anything else, is the concept of self 1 versus self 2, right? And the book at the very beginning kind of sets it up like, so you're doing your sport or your game or whatever, and something goes wrong, and you get into this mental narrative where you're like, "Ah, you dumbass! Like, why didn't you just do the right thing? Oh, you suck!" Right? And then the author like kind of pauses you right there, right? Because like I just said that, and we're all in that mental frame, right? I know exactly what that feels like to be having that mental conversation, right? Um, and the author goes, "Okay, now pause. Like, you're yelling at yourself, but who is you and who is yourself, right? Because there are very clearly two people in this conversation. One of them is being a complete dick to the other one. Why? Right? And then it kind of delves into this notion that it's sort of your conscious process, right? That is being a dick to your unconscious process and being like, why did you not build the buildings in your Cannon Rush better? Why can't you just remember to probe in your macro game? All of these kinds of things. And then from there, it evolves into all of this stuff about how to get that conscious mind to cooperate a little bit more with the unconscious mind.
Right. And this book has probably the most applicable just life lesson that you can find in all the books that we went over.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the self-judging mind that I think most people have, this internal narrative of telling themselves they're bad, they're dumb, they're stupid, they're terrible when something goes wrong in their life, and not
Yeah.
just in a game. I think StarCraft as a game, as a video game, or tennis in the case of the book, as a metaphor for life, right? When things don't work out, how many times has any one of us told ourselves, you idiot, like what were you thinking? And this narrative is highly destructive to learning when you are trying to tell yourself, not only you're putting yourself down, but then you're going to say, okay, dummy, do it this way and make sure you do this and that. You don't want to miss this key indicator. And that is so counterproductive to
Mm-hmm.
learning in general, and just how humans learn, mainly through a lot of emulation, right? Just if you look at little children and babies, how they learn languages and how to walk, it's trial and error, and emulation are the main ways they do it. They don't have the language skills. So when we think about this internal narrative of telling ourselves what to do as if you have an inside your head coach, it is really inefficient, and it is like a huge roadblock that can cause learning to slow down. And I think that what the vicious cycle that I know definitely I have felt, and probably other people have felt, is this judging, this overthinking, this judging, try hard, right? You overthink it, you judge yourself for not doing right, and then you go into try hard mode, because the next game you're going to do better, right? I'm going to get that MMR back, and I'm going to even APM faster. Right? I'm going to mash my keyboard this much faster. That's going to get my MMR back. And that mentality is so counterproductive to the way that you want to let this subconscious mind, the self two, as it's referred to in the book, take over and just go for it, right? You don't want to have any narrative, in that you want to let your mind just go. And it's this sort of thing that I've been practicing this past week, of reminding myself to let go of the attachment to winning a game, like the get that self one out of there. Just let go of that and let yourself separate into like play the game. The self-conscious mind's going to take over. You know what you're doing, right? You know how to control the units, all these things. And getting into that mind state, which is hard to do for sure, especially in my case, hard to do.
Yeah, definitely. I think there are a lot of pieces to that, and I remember one of the things I was really trying to untangle about this is, to me, it feels as though StarCraft necessitates both minds. Um, so an example of that would be, my execution of my build, my control of the units, right? Some of these things you were listing, those are totally unconscious processes, and I want to not mess with that, right? And then also, if my opponent does something weird, right? I gotta pick up on that, and I have to consciously think, okay, we need to deviate from our normal here, right? But ideally, that process is like, okay, conscious mind says we need to deviate. It opens up kind of a handful of options, right? Selects an option, hands that to the unconscious process, and then lets it run, right? And oftentimes for me, instead what that looks like is, oh shit, 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 and then the game ends, right? And it's like you never hand control back to the unconscious process to like do the stuff. You're just panicked, right? Um, I think the other interesting thing besides that, that you said, was this kind of attachment to winning concept. And the book almost frames it as like beginner's luck, right? Where you start off and you don't have any expectations. You're like, well, I've never played tennis before and I've just picked up a racket, so whatever. And then you like kind of play good at first. You're like surprisingly efficient for somebody who just watched somebody like whack a ball a couple times. And then you latch onto it. You're like, oh, I'm good, right? And immediately you tank because that conscious process starts to have ego about it.
Right. And this is one of the things about Inner Game of Tennis is the author is, a bit into the Zen Buddhist sort of mind and strategy here, where it's the ego that does a lot of damage to you. And it's true, as soon as you start telling yourself that you're good at this because, you're you, rather than you've put in the work and the effort and that's paying off. As soon as it's like, well, it is me after all playing this game, therefore I'm good at it. It's just disaster, right? The whole structure, the house of cards starts to collapse because that mindset activates self one. Self one says, yes, I am very good at this. Let me just make a few decisions here to win this game. And it's all downhill from there.
Right.
One thing that stuck out to me this time when I did review what I had written about the book and had thought about this book was that there is this idea that I glossed over the first time I read it. And it was that when he, in the very beginning, he's talking about coaching players of tennis who have played tennis for a while, that they want to improve. They're average good tennis players, maybe amateur. They want to make that kind of pro-am jump, and they're going to him, who's a pro tennis player, and they want to make that leap. He was training them to do things by just watching his movements, and he was learning, like, hey, look in the mirror and all these different techniques, rather than telling him, okay, put your foot here and twist this way. And it stuck out to me as a bit of a caveat when we think about learning, especially in StarCraft, is that there is a requirement to learn some basic skills that there's probably no other good way than saying, okay, if I took a new player and we're in bronze, the very lowest league that we have in StarCraft, I'm going to say, okay, we need to learn hotkeys. You're going to click the town hall, command center, or whatever you want to call it, and you're going to make a worker. You need to be doing that every time at this time, 30 seconds, whatever the time ratio is. And that's like a basic skill that, yeah, you could watch somebody, but you can also be told to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to be doing that the entire game, for example. And once you've built those up, and I think a lot of us, especially diamond level players, which is the majority of people that watch StarCraft streams and are involved on the ladder and so forth, it's kind of in that high plat, low diamond. That's where the peak is, more or less, of the people that are actively trying to learn. We've developed those skills to some proficiency. We're definitely not great at them, but there's a proficiency there.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where self one starts to jump in. And I think a lot of players can identify with this idea of you started in bronze or silver, and really, once you start learning the game, your MMR just shoots up really fast. You hit this plateau, you get to diamond, and you're like, oh man, I'm not winning anymore by doing just the things I used to do, building workers, for example, or making sure you're not supply blocked. And I think part of that is that you get the proficiency of the basics, and Self One jumps in there and says, well, hey, I'm pretty good at this game, so why don't I start telling you what to do? And when you screw up, I'm going to tell you how bad you are because what you did didn't work. I really believe that that is where this concept of forever diamonds, if you've been around Twitch for a while, you kind of know forever diamond. I think that's where it comes from, because people believe that they're good once they hit diamond, and they don't recognize that they've gained proficiency in a skill. They haven't gained mastery of those skills. And it's really the mastery that we're talking about in a lot of these books too, as we go through the rest of them, particularly in the inner game of tennis, though, is the people he was coaching were good at tennis. They were probably, if I picked up a racket and played any of those people, I would lose because I'm a beginner at tennis. And I think that that's a key point that we have to keep in mind, is that when you're gaining the basic skills and you have this solid foundation without bad habits, then you can go on to this stage where get rid of that Self One, or if you have a coach, the coach no longer needs to tell you things like that, and you're going to go into this Self Two sort of learning state.
Yeah, I think um, what stuck out to me is really interesting. So first, totally agree with everything that you said. And I've been, I am one of these kind of stuck at diamond people, right? And so obviously I've given a lot of thought to this, right? Where it's like, wait, why did this meteoric rise of MMR come to a halt, right? Like a screeching, grinding halt. And I think part of it is that yeah, initially you're right. You really can just get by with instruction. You need to be constantly making workers. You need to not supply block. You need to spend your money, right? And I can give you that if you're brand new, and you'll get like at least gold pretty quickly. Like, I mean, you could almost do that by the aforementioned, hop in your custom game and practice thing, and then just go on the ladder, and like you'll make all kinds of horrible decisions, bad compositions, take bad fights, whatever, but you'll have way more and you'll win. And I think what really gets people stuck is there's not a great parallel to the concept introduced in the book of, hey, just watch me do this, right? And you'll sort of pick up all the tacit knowledge, like all of these things without me having to say, okay, here's my gigantic flow chart of early game PvT and all the weird deviations that the Terran might make you take if you scout this or that. And here's the minimal amount of defense you need to build, and all these different, really, really nuanced things. The answer to that generally is either what I just said, a coach trying to hammer in all of this like weirdly nuanced knowledge into your conscious process, or alternatively, play just billions and billions of games until your Self 2 kind of picks up how to intuit its way through all of that. I think that the problem we have in StarCraft is there's not an easy way to immediately jump to the point in the game where you need to do that. So, every game we play starts off at 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and you build up your economy and you do some scouting and whatnot. And there are all these different points stratified throughout, the duration of a game where you might have to do this forking process. And yes, we can resume from replay, but it's kind of slow, it's kind of clunky. I need a practice partner to do it. There's not a good way to just isolate a skill in the way that you can with tennis. And so a lot of these things in the book sort of broke down. The other thing along those lines that broke down that we talked about in that episode was the notion of like distract your conscious process by saying, hey, just look at the seams on the tennis ball, right? I wasn't able to really map that to a StarCraft concept either. And so this was actually like what made me want to do the archives to begin with, is I'm reading this, I'm like, shit, I can't figure out, I know the concepts in this book are right, and I cannot for the life of me figure out how to use that to get that last little step in StarCraft to actually get some mileage out of it.
That's a really insightful point. That I remember we talked about this when we did the episode a little bit, but it's just coming back to me now as you're saying it. One of the things that I thought of as you were just bringing this point up is I think that the StarCraft community, not to be political, but we're in a current time in history outside of StarCraft where there's a lot of change.
Mm.
And I think this is probably a time for StarCraft to also have some change in it as well, as a parallel, in that the community, and I'm guilty of this too. I'm not going to try and play it off like I'm taking the higher road here. The community often emphasizes playing alone on the ladder as the best practice, and it's really not. It gives you variety, but it's not the best practice. We know that through countless studies from learning and neuroscience, and all the books that we've read here indicate that that is not the best way to practice. So grinding games we know is not the best way to practice, but there is a culture of you play alone, you never rematch anybody. If we hit people on ladder, most of the time, I know myself get kind of irritated, like, oh, this guy again, you know. I just lost him or I just beat him. And either way, it's not like practice partners are all that common. Now there are people who do it, and there are coaches who do it. They make their players do practice games, but I think for the majority, from my observation, most people don't. And one streamer who's notorious for raging, Hupsea, he says this a lot on his stream, where he'll play somebody, get angry that he lost, and he'll immediately whisper them and say, would let's do a rematch. And 99 times out of 100, the player either won't respond or say no. And it's crazy to think at the highest level, which is, GM level, where he sort of sits in his MMR, that people would not be like, yeah, let's practice. That build was really good. I'm not going to take it personally that I lost, that you might be better than me one time, or I might be better than you, or maybe we're about the same. Let's do a couple games. Because if you went and played basketball, tennis, soccer, whatever, sure. Like if you played something and you lost, be like, hey, let's do another. Like that was really cool. Like it's all the time you do that sort of stuff, and outside in physical sports. But for some reason in our community, we emphasize not doing that. We're completely insular to each individual. And there's this idea of like, well, we shouldn't rematch, we shouldn't play again. And Blizzard did give us a tool to do this that I literally have never used. In a replay, you can restart the match from a specific point. Why don't we do that, right? Why would, in the case of like Hupsea message or something, why wouldn't the other player come back and say like, hey, let's play from 10 minutes on? We don't have to do all this beginner stuff because, we know how to macro. Let's just do the army stuff where we want to practice. Why aren't we civil to each other in doing that? I think really this is a tragic situation in our community, that we're not nice enough to each other and don't take things personally, because we all know there's no rage like gamer rage, like, whew. But we take it personally, that we're just like, no, F that guy or F that person. I'm not going to play them again. I don't want to see them again. I just want to be anonymous on the ladder. And I think it's really negative.
Yeah, definitely. I think for sure there's something being lost there. And it is interesting that other sports, be they physical or mental, do not have this, right? So, you can think of, yeah, basketball, you can think of, games of chess. Even, when I was playing Magic like semi-competitively, we would do this all the time. I mean, you'd play no stakes, just to practice a matchup, or even from that rage standpoint. I'm kind of curious now that you said this about Hupsea, like whether he's doing it because he thinks it will help him learn, or if it's a way to process the anger for him, or a bit of both, right? I should ask him that. It'd be interesting.
It would be
Um,
interesting, yeah.
but yeah, I think there's for sure something being lost. For me, I find the resume from replay thing a little bit clunky. Um, there are a few things. One, I don't like to wait for it to load. Two, I find it a little bit weird and jarring to be like, okay, and now you're playing StarCraft, right? And you like flip the switch from like, I wasn't, to it's 10 minutes in, you have all these hotkeys set up, and your army is like literally moving right now, and you gotta like, oh, okay, let me, Um, so I almost wonder if it could benefit from, if you played like Quake, or if you played the Diabolical beta when it came out, they both have this kind of like warm up thing. I almost wonder if something like that, not that they're going to like patch StarCraft 2 to do this, but like, I wonder if something like that would be the answer, right? Where, you resume from replay at 10 minutes, and then you get like 3 seconds worth of just kind of dicking around time that gets rewound and doesn't count, right? But you're just like, okay, what's about to happen? What's about to play out? And I get to kind of like, okay, let me feel what it's like. Okay, these are the units on hotkey 2, etc. Um, the other thing that I find really problematic about the resume from replay is if you resume from someone else's replay, there's no way to not have your hotkeys be a disaster. And so often I'll have, a GM in my chat who will say, hey, let me resume from replay against your practice partner and just show you the right way to do it. I'll just win this fight that you're saying is unwinnable by demonstrating how to properly control this fight. And it like kind of sort of works, but you again have to do this song and dance of, okay, well, we want to do the fight at 10 minutes, but let's just resume at 9:45 so that the grandmaster can like unhotkey all the weird stuff that you had set up and have it match their setup. What was my other thought? So the other thing that I think is huge here is we incentivize games of StarCraft with MMR. And you don't get there's no way for me to be like, Adraseth, you just whooped my ass on the ladder. How about a rematch for stakes, right? Like I can't put some MMR on the line to incentivize you to do it. So you're right, it boils back down to being nice to one another, where it's like you're going out of your way to help me with that rematch versus go hunt for another nerd to bash and steal MMR from. So, I get that there's like win trading implications and stuff there. So that's the reason that we don't have that, play for stakes kind of thing. But it is a little bit of a bummer that we are backed into that corner.
Well, I think uh, the third thing you said there, where yeah, it is being nice, and you're right. Not having incentive is actually a really interesting point that you raise. But when another player wins, you're right. They probably think that they would have to be nice to you and like, oh, it's helping the loser out. But in reality, anybody we hit on the ladder is nearly probably within 50 MMR most of the time, unless you're GM, then things get wacky. But at the lower levels where the peak of the Gaussian curve is, where all the players sit, um, we're within 50 MMR of each other, which means we're basically equivalent skill. And that means I can take a game off you just like you can take a game off me. So if I lose to you and we rematch because I want to try it again or something like that, the opponent who won has just as much, I think, just as much to stand to learn and improve by repeating things like that, because we know certain types of repetition are really good.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I agree with you on the resume from replay as well, that it isn't ideal. And I think that we are going to identify some other techniques as we move through these books that are much better for practice. But it does exist. And it I do think that it's sad that we have that individuality culture of don't help your fellow StarCraft player, like F them. Like I think that it would be nicer if that was the case. And back when both of us were younger, teenage years, when you did play games online, there were no ladders, and so it was a very different system. So I recall I used to play a lot of Myth: The Fallen Lords and Myth 2: Soulblighter, both Bungie games that are kind of RTS like, but you don't build the army, you start with an army. And you had to join a lobby before you could play a game. And there was a ranking system, so you gained points or lost points based on who you played, but you didn't just get automatically matched. So when you joined a lobby, you were in that person's room, and when the game was over, you were still in that room. You didn't go like drop out and hide, which is basically how the ladder works now. You kind of have that anonymity. Um, so you'd be in a chat room with this person, and the communities were also smaller because gaming wasn't as popular, so people knew who each other were, and there's a reputation there, especially if you disconnected or something like that. There were all sorts of things like that, and I think that actually, the convenience of hitting a button and getting a game is nice, but for learning purposes, I kind of feel like the older system is better for it.
Yeah, it's interesting that you hit on the community size aspect of this. I think where with games that are more niche and like, I know this may sound weird, right? Because StarCraft 2 has so much baggage about, falling from being the number one thing, but like we are still actually pretty big as a community. And if you instead look at, something like uh it's the new Quick Champions or whatever, that's a small enough community where the people who are good, like if you go watch like Rafa or somebody, right? You watch him stream, he's mostly doing duels. And he's doing duels with people that he knows are at the higher end, and he's better than most of them. But he's like, well, shit, there's nobody else around, right? So, like, stomping you for a while is actually like the literal best practice available to me. Um, and it is more like, because I'm from the olden days of the internet too, right? Where I know what you're talking about. You used to just hang out in these chat rooms, and like that was your cue, right? Was hanging out in a lobby, being like, does anybody want to play with me? And there was more of this, even if there was a rank system, there was more of this notion of like, I want to get better so that when I do meet some arbitrary nerd off the street who I don't know, I can kick their ass, right? It was more focused on I want to build skill in myself than I want to get my ladder points up so that I have like a cool badge and I can show off my internet points kind of thing.
Yeah. And I remember my experience in those days when I was playing a lot of Myth, and I ended up making friends with the one of the players that was top 3 in the community, and I was just like, oh my gosh, it's that dude, right? And it was kind of like that reputation precedes you, and there's sort of this whole, it builds upon how you approach the game. I think when you have sort of this accountability as well as interaction going on, where you feel more like you all like a Magic the Gathering, or like if you go play D&D, you're like in a room with people, so you can't just be a jerk and just peace out and go to another room. That's where it is. You got to go play there. And so I think that adds a lot to the way the game is approached. But maybe we should move on from Inner Game of Tennis, which is a fantastic book. Go read it if you haven't, to our next book.
Yeah. So Make It Stick was our second episode. And the concept that I chose for this one that really stood out to me as the and this was a tough one, man. Picking my favorite concept from this book, but I think the one that stands out as the most useful for StarCraft is the concept of desirable difficulty. And this is one of those incredibly counterintuitive, like, I really don't want this to be true. And I read the book and the science says that it is, so I guess I'm stuck. This is the notion that as I'm practicing something, I don't want to get to where like it feels totally easy and effortless and then just hammer that, just mass practice of like, okay, do that thing, do that thing, do that thing over and over and over while it's feeling easy. It should be a little bit of a struggle. And this is something that actually was like front of mind for me. This was not like oh, I remember that. This is something I've really kept with me because I get people in the chat, man, every stream like, what? I don't know about this focus goal, right? And they'll either say that's too few probes to try to make by that time, that's too many probes by that time. And this is one of the only things, like, I'm pretty good, I think, at entertaining ideas that my chat has about me being wrong, right? I'm generally open most of the time, but I stand firm on the focus goal stuff because I've felt it out and I've been doing it for enough years now that I know how to set something that's like kind of sort of just within my reach and also still difficult. And I know what it feels like to get that a little bit wrong, where I'm like, oh, okay, I'm 100% on this focus goal. It's probably too easy. Or I'm 0% on this focus goal. It's probably too hard. And by being able to really fine tune that with a specific goal, make this many probes by this time, or attack with this exact composition of army by such and such time, you need to be at their door. These things are really, really easy to tune and to keep them difficult, right? If I want to hit 2 seconds earlier, what do I have to do? Oh, I got to tighten up my probing so that I have money, and everything else kind of like follows nicely from it. But I think the big thing here is avoiding that massed practice. And this is the thing that everybody in our scene preaches that I just want to like shake them and get it out of their head.
I think that the terminology is the big problem in a lot of the cases here. First of all, I agree. We're always often on the same page, and we have spoken offline well, I guess it's online, but not on stream, let's say, about focus goals and picking goals. And recently I was kind of deciding on some goals for myself and how long to sit on that goal and really work on it. As you know, okay, maybe I was doing good that one day, but do I repeat it the next day? Do I go to it the third day? In Make It Stick, there's a lot of information in the book that talks about varying the objective, because even though you feel like you haven't really mastered it, going to something else is actually pretty good for your brain. And there's case studies where they do these things with, you know, tests and quizzes and college level students where they are given, you know, a wealth of information, like study this and go do it, and there's no possible way that they can know everything, but yet they actually do better overall at recalling later on than if you're given a smaller amount of information, you just like focus on that and just hammer that one thing. And this relates to StarCraft and that mass practice mentality of, and if you remember, it was like a kind of a meme in Wings of Liberty. It was like 4 gate to Grandmaster or 4 gate to Master, where you could build stalkers every single game, every single matchup, and win the game in the early days of Wings of Liberty. And you'll see this on like Reddit or some of these, you know, social sites where people are like, why don't you just all in every game? And you can, but you're literally training this one thing to be really good at that one thing, and that's it, right? It's super hyper narrow focused, and what you're doing is mass practice of one thing, which we know is not the best and most efficient way to learn. And so there was a movement, and there has been multiple times people bring up deliberate practice, where we're going to deliberately practice a thing, but it is a term that is so convoluted in our community and misused, where people will say deliberate practice of skill X, and really what, when they describe it, they're talking about mass practice. They're talking about just repeating something again and again and again and again and again, which again we know by case studies, by published scientific literature, is not the way to go. The way to go is to vary that up. And so, you know, Eret, super, you know, uh, kind of famous for your practice goals, and I know you got those from Maynard, or I think it was Maynard, right?
Yep.
Initially, but you vary those quite a bit, and for good reason, because we know the brain learns better when you have variety in your goals. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have a goal, but this idea of deliberate practice being really pervasive through StarCraft, as far as I can tell, is actually incorrect. I think most people are using that term incorrectly, and unfortunately, they're just massing practice.
Right.
The other side of that, and I'm 100% guilty of this. Again, all these things I talk about, it's a lot because I have personal experience in the way I learned StarCraft and doing the bad habit of, you kind of get irritated that self-one comes back and like, oh, stupid idiot, I'm just going to play again. And you click the play again button without, and you just lose the focus goal. You lose whatever it was, and you're just grinding games after, you know, you lose a game or two in a row. And all of a sudden now for the next hour, you've ground games out. And well, what a waste of an hour, because it's not very effective at learning. So it's finding a challenge, finding a goal that is difficult enough, not too difficult, not too, you know, it's the Goldilocks. It needs to be difficult enough, and it probably needs to be more difficult than you think it needs to be, because it has to be a challenge for you to learn. And going after that goal with some gusto is the best way to learn, as far as we can tell. There's a lot of science that backs this up. And one of the things I thought of is that, like, baseball players will do this pretty commonly. They'll train with a heavy bat when they're in training, so that when they get to the plate with their regular bat, it feels lighter to them because they've been training with this heavier bat. Is it effective for them to swing a heavy bat? Maybe a professional athlete could, but it trains them in a way that's different from what they actually are doing. And that's another key point in Make It Stick, is that you don't necessarily, if you're missing probes or something, or you're not building workers at certain times, it doesn't mean necessarily you need to spend the next 6 months building workers at that specific time. There are ways to learn to teach yourself to address that problem by not actually doing the thing, you know, not just sitting there building probes or, you know, drones at 4 minutes, but doing other things, other types of practice. It is hard to identify. That's my one criticism of the book, is that you're laid out this sort of roadmap of how to do this, but then when we go to StarCraft and put it into practice, it becomes quite difficult. And I think, Eric, you've been really successful at identifying how to make a focus goal and standing your ground with your chat in a lot of ways, with the Twitch GMs, as we all know, literal and figurative, standing your ground with the focus goals, because you really have to think them out carefully. I think it's quite difficult to really come up with these practices. And the one we've talked about a lot and has been on discussions in chat and in Discord is the beanbag throwing with the kids, where the kids were, there were two groups of kids. One group was throwing beanbags at a cornhole thing, this summertime lawn thing we do in the Midwest, at 5 feet, which was what the competition would be at. And then another group did it at 4 feet and 6 feet as their training. And then when it came to compete, the 4 foot, 6 foot group actually was able to nail the 5 foot better than the kids that trained at 5 foot. And the whole idea is that varied practice, that increased difficulty, probably from going too short to going too long, made them have the hand-eye coordination, dexterity to estimate distance very well. Whereas the 5 footers, they just did that one distance again and again and again. They probably got good at it, but they never developed that ability to estimate very well. And translating it over to StarCraft, although really important, is extremely difficult in my experience.
Yeah, I think this is another one of those things where, reading these books made me have to think, gosh, we must build a community around considering these ideas and the application to StarCraft, because we both come from scientific backgrounds of various types, right? We accept that the science is true. The book lays it out in a way that intuitively feels right to me as well. When it says, that icky feeling of something being like too hard and you're, oh gosh, I just can't get it. That's when the learning's actually happening.
Right.
It still feels icky for me, still feels horrible. But when I look back, I go, man, I sure learned more about cannon rushing those first few times when printf was like, no, do this. Okay, no, wait, do that. And I said, but printf, it's hard, right? I'm doing everything wrong, right? I sure built a lot more skill during those first couple times than I have in the past, I don't know, year, right? Of trying to repeat stuff. And the reason that I feel like we need to get more people thinking about this stuff and we need a community around it is what you say. It's so difficult, even after having accepted these concepts, to figure out how to map them appropriately. So to your point about, me varying focus goals, this is something I've been wrestling with, and I've been kind of toying with the idea of, what does that really look like, right? So, one type of varied practice is I might play a Terran this match, I might play a Zerg the next match. That's varied. Scoping it down a bit, I might play a Terran who plays super hyper standard one match, and I might play a Terran who wants to build 3 barracks and a bunker across the map in my NAT, and everything in between. So there's shades of variation there. I might play a Terran who wants to play a hyper standard, but has shitty macro and really good Reaper control in one game. The next game I might queue a Terran who still wants to play hyper standard, but is the other way around. So where along that continuum of differences that I just listed, by the way, none of which addresses whatever the hell I'm doing, right? Am I on the same build, different build, same map, different map? Am I tired, awake, alert, whatever? What counts as sameness, right? I think it's very easy for us, and gosh, I cringe now when I hear people say deliberate practice, because I don't hate the concept of deliberate practice, but I know that when people in our scene say it, they mean massed practice, and that gives me the oh, you're wasting your time, we can recognize that something like oh, let me just drill splitting my workers onto mineral patches at the beginning of the game, right? Which is one of these things that came from that deliberate practice movement in our scene. There's literally a custom map for it, and respect to the people who set that up. They're trying to do something good, but we know that is mass practice, right? So I don't want to do that. I'm actually a huge fan of printf's minute micro. I warm up with it frequently on my stream, but again, it would be mass practice if I sit there and hammer the same, shoot the Marines challenge with my stalkers. So I'll do it a little bit here and there, with spaced repetition, another concept from the book, where, if I'm just doing it 3 or 4 times at the beginning of my stream and then going, okay, retest in a week. Do you remember how to do this? That clearly works. But where in between those two things, of the one that's clearly bad and the one that's sort of okay, what does varying my practice actually look like? So, in the past, I've changed my focus goal every stream. I've been sitting on one for the past, I don't know, 3 weeks right now. And I don't know if that's good or bad, right? I'm getting different Terran opponents, but it's a Terran focus goal, and I'm working on, producing probes. It's just really hard for me to figure out.
I think, yeah, this is it's such a great point that you raise, and probably all of us are kind of guilty of the mass practice when we think it's deliberate practice, especially with a lot of these arcade maps and the warm up trainers and all sorts of things. I do them, you do them. There's a whole list of different trainers that you can use, but how many of us do them with enough variety as well as the recall? Because something that I didn't mention and you just brought up, which is really important in Make It Stick, is recalling the information. You have to recall the information. You have to sort of slightly forget about it and then recall the information. That's how the learning has to go. If you don't have that, it's just not as effective. It's not that you won't learn. It's just not as effective. And I think this is really key in everything we're talking about. Mass practice will get you better eventually, but it's not as effective. It's just not as effective. So it's like, running in dress shoes or something. Like, it's just like, you can do it, but I don't know why you'd want to do it, but you could do it. And it's a really tricky thing to develop the correct plan. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later on in some of the other books about coaching and information that you have available to you within StarCraft. But I think the nature of StarCraft makes it extremely difficult. Whereas something like chess or playing a musical instrument, you don't have the same restrictions imposed upon the person learning. And that's where the difficulty comes. But yeah, is 2 weeks enough of a focus goal? Is 3 weeks enough? Is 3 days enough? I don't know. I have been leaning towards my personal, experiment for myself has been leaning towards playing less and studying more. So I've actually taken some time away from my streaming. So the days that I'm not streaming, I'm still doing StarCraft related things, but I'm studying StarCraft rather than playing StarCraft. And I'm seeing if that helps me. And I think in ways it does, but again, to be quantitative about it, to be scientific about it, I'm going to really need to do it for a while and see. And it does come a little bit back to inner game of tennis, where you can observe a good player if you're studying, observe a good player doing the things that maybe you would do, but they're doing it better, and you can observe the differences. A lot of times we watch streams and we're watching to maybe post some memes in chat, and we're kind of enjoying tastosis, and we're not really studying. But if you go and actually study, really involve yourself in what's going on in the game, um, maybe more like Artosis's and No Regrets in-depth series, studying the game, I think that can help a lot too in identifying the things that you need to practice and how long you need to practice them, as well as we have the ability to look at our own replays, right? So, but it's tough. I don't have a great answer. I don't have the silver bullet. I wish I did.
Yeah. Yeah, I think good call outs there. I'm definitely guilty of that. Hopping on the Twitch stream, and I'm there and ostensibly like I'm watching games, but mostly I'm like reading the chat and just kind of dicking around, goofing off with my friends. I think for me to actually learn, sometimes I might need to just put it full screen and stop interacting, or never start, right? Don't announce that I'm there, and like just kind of like, okay, let's pay attention to what printf is doing and why, right? Um yeah. I think probably in the interest of time, it makes sense for us to jump to book 3 here. Um oh gosh, I just blanked on this is Checklist Manifesto, right? Yeah, okay. So the concept that I picked here is the concept of forcing functions, which is kind of was a new term to me when I read this book, but it's the idea of what is a way in a high pressure situation that we can just induce a desirable behavior. So this can look like anything under the sun, but just to give you some examples to make it a little bit concrete, maybe I, when I'm getting cheesed, reliably supply block myself. And this would be a really common one for Protosses who are just starting to learn how to hold an early pool in a PVZ. Oftentimes the advice is, well, hey, make a zealot, right? Where you wouldn't normally make a zealot. And then reliably you supply block your shit because you're not used to needing that second pylon as early as you do if you make that zealot, right? So a forcing function would be something like, okay, if you see that early pool, make a zealot and a pylon. So the zealot acts as a trigger for a pylon. Another one that's really common for me in the build that I do in PvZ and in PvT is when I take my robo, I know down the road in a minute here, I'm going to need more gas. And so a way to prevent the problem of, oh gosh, I just got this tech, it's really gas hungry, now I don't have any gas to fund it, and I've messed my macro all up in this game, is another forcing function where I bundle, get this robo, take the gas. Get the robo, take the gas. And I just, you tie these things kind of together. It doesn't have to be a pair of buildings that you're making. It can also be something like when this scout, right, whether it's adept and observer, I'm using Protoss terms because they're familiar, but substitute whatever works for your race. When this adept hits the enemy base, I know her job is to check drone count with the shade, check for the presence of a third with her actual body, and, by the way, you better start another adept and your glaives while all of that's happening, or your build is messed up. And so again, that becomes this tight little package in my head that's a forcing function to remind me to make the adept and make the glaives, because what's on screen is the adept and her shade, and I'm already managing 2 screens. I'm really not thinking about whatever's happening at home, but I do have it hotkeyed, and it is possible for me to do it, so I can kind of force the desirable behavior.
Yeah, you bring up some really, really good points, I think, in StarCraft. And just, I think most people know us who will be listening to this podcast. If you're from the future, hello. And people live in Twitch right now know us. We're both Protoss players. That's mainly because we both play with Xbox 360 controllers, and we just have 2 buttons bound there. That's why we're Protoss players. Everybody knows that. But when we talk about especially cheese in the early game, which, oh man, cheese, what a great topic. People hate cheese. Oh man, the rage that cheese induces on the ladder. I think I used to be like this. I would, oh, this is bullshit. But it's, it's part of the game. And now I have a very different opinion about it. Over the years, I've gotten better. Cheese is super valid. It's super interesting way of playing. And yeah, if you want to get better, you better learn to defend it. And your example of an early pull, if it in a Protoss versus Zerg, Zerg goes for an early pull, you have to defend Zealots. And you have to now make a few decisions. One is how many units to make to defend this. You need to know how all in it is, and whether or not you take an expansion, whether or not you're going to try and get some tech out, if you're pulling guys off gas, that your workers off gas. There's a lot of decisions to be made. But one of the first things that will happen to you is, if you're losing to early pools as a Protoss player, is your wall might be janky and messed up because you're nervous, and 2, you're supply blocked. And it took me a tremendous amount of practice to remember the first thing I do when I see an early pool is make a pylon. Because for me, that supply block, that was the only way I could learn to get out of that supply block. I would make the pylon, then the zealot. And until I, got that kind of automatic in my brain, I would lose to early pulls all the time. And there's other strategies. I won't go into the huge details of it, but what happens, and I notice this in my play as well, and I think this is a really interesting thing, is that when you get off the script, because we all sort of have our builds, if we're playing, especially in playing in Diamond, if you're playing in Gold, you might have one build that you're doing, and you can do it all 3 matchups, and that's fine. In Platinum, you're starting to diversify. You might have one build per race. In Diamond, you definitely have one or more builds per race that you're doing. And in Master, of course, you have a variety of builds that you can pick and play out. And it's like a musical piece. You know the notes from the beginning all the way to the end. And you can kind of, or like a chess opening, you can, okay, I'm going to go here. And when the player does this, then I'm going to do this. And I'm going to respond in a certain way depending on their actions. But When things go off script, when the player does something you're not expecting, you scout something you wouldn't normally see, and you're, well, that's weird. What do I do? That's when things go to shit. That's where pylons get forgotten, supplies blocked, workers don't get made, money doesn't get spent, production doesn't go down. And the reason why is you're consciously thinking about, oh shit, what do I do now? Oh shit, what do I do now? And checklists are so good at dealing with these situations, especially in the book Checklist Manifesto. They talk a lot about pilots and flying. So when something, normally a flight takes off, it goes up to its place and it lands, no problem. But when something goes wrong, you don't really want to be thinking about, should I check the oil pressure on the engine, or should I check, the temperature, or whatever it is. You want a checklist to go down the list of boom, boom, boom. These are the things I need to do, and I need to do them in this order, and I need to do them efficiently. And this is something that the Checklist Manifesto really emphasizes, that getting the steps right is really hard, even if you know them. So you may know inherently, we can talk about baneling all-ins or something like that. We may know how to defend those. Yeah, okay, get some sentries and, shield batteries and whatever. But knowing that in the moment is really, really hard. And that's where checklists can come in really handy. Now, in StarCraft, you can't really say, hang on a second, let me pull out my laminated checklist and go down it. But you can train this way. You can train to have different checklists. Again, if you have a practice partner, this is a great way to do that. Have them do a few baneling all-ins to you, or 12 pulls or whatever, and you're going to go down and start developing your checklist. Write down the steps you're going to do and start getting that inherent into your memory. And then maybe you do something else and you come back and you recall, because make it stick is really important. We know recalling is really important. And then all of a sudden you develop a mental checklist, which I think is another term that's thrown around, and I think it's inappropriately thrown around for the most part in our community. But it really is something you have, and you can develop a mental checklist. When the game goes off in this fork, I've seen that before. I need to do X, Y, and Z. And Artosis says this a lot in the GSL cast that he does. And I mean, who doesn't love Artosis and Tasteless? Like, such great casters. But he'll say this a lot, is that when you get ahead, when you're really far ahead, all you have to do is remember what might kill you, right?
Yep.
And prepare for it. Whether it's a cloaked unit, because the player behind is going to take a huge risk to come back. So DTs need to be prepared for them. Banshees need to be prepared for them. Whatever it is, you need to prepare for that. And if you do, you'll just easily win the game. But remembering that in the moment is super hard if you haven't had some sort of practice with it, varied practice and recall. So I think that this is the book. When we read it, I remember it was a little bit hard to tie it to StarCraft directly, because they really literally talk about paper checklists that people are checking off in a clipboard. But I think that after I came back to the book, my interpretation is that you can actually integrate this well into your practice, and getting these scenarios down of, when this happens, this is the list of things I do. Just like when you see the early pool, it's like, oh, pylon, zealot, extra gateways, finish the wall, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think I had similar struggles when we read this one, almost to the point where I thought, gosh, I really enjoyed this book. I buy the idea of checklists in my life, and man, I don't even know if we were right to do this for the show. That was like my initial kind of emotion. And I'm really glad that you just said this, because I had the same realization kind of reflecting back on it, that, yeah, actually, this totally did apply. And maybe I didn't see it. Maybe I was too close to the material, or I don't quite know what, but I didn't map it as well to StarCraft as I feel you just did with what you said. And I think that's exactly right. I do have the thing that Artosis always, calls out, that, how do I lose? For me, I actually got that from Magic. And I kind of had it for free coming into StarCraft, even when I was bronze. I didn't know any of the particulars about StarCraft that would, allow me to process how could I lose, right? Even though I played it as a kid, like even something as simple as, oh, they might make DTs, I should get an observer, was beyond me. But the core concept of, I'm ahead, let me just quickly run down the ways my opponent could possibly survive, right? Is that, they hide a million bases? Do they make cloaked units? Do they backstab me when my army moves out and I'm unprepared and somehow I control poorly on two fronts? You kind of have that little thing, then you run through it. Another place where I think I have this, and you might as well. We both have done some scuba diving. You much more than me, and the checklist that you get in that context is definitely an oh shit checklist, just like it would be in aviation. However, it is more like StarCraft in the sense that you, for sure, do not have a laminated checklist with you underwater that's going to say, this is what I need to do if I have a regulator failure or whatever it is. And I almost wonder if there's something we can pull from that context, right? That shared context that we have to map this better to StarCraft.
That's really good example, I think, because I didn't even think about it, even though I do a lot of scuba diving. You're absolutely right. In scuba diving, as you know, you're underwater and you can't talk to your partner. You can't talk to any of the people down there. You can kind of make noise, but they're not going to hear you. Um, Writing is kind of hard. You can get slates, but that's not very easy. And there are laminated cards you can take down. We take them down for teaching, just to make sure we don't miss any skills. I have plenty of checklists for diving. I have gear checklists. I have pre-dive checklists. I have safety checklists. I have all kinds of checklists. We use them a lot. We use them mostly 99% of the time on the surface because I can talk. There's no stress. Everybody's hanging out. So we go through all the steps. Okay, for this dive, this is what we're going to do. And when we check everybody's gear, go through, okay, make sure. Most of the time I use a mental checklist when I do these things because I've been doing it so much that I don't have to refer to the checklist, but I still have them as backup. When we're underwater, though, you don't have that. And you need to respond quickly and calmly to any, especially as an instructor, which I'm not an instructor, but as a dive master, I've helped with a lot of basic classes, beginner classes. When you're teaching, you need to respond quickly and calmly to any problem that arises because the student 8 out of 10 times isn't going to do it. You're going to have to do it for them. And the way that we do that, and in my experience, the way that we do that is we do a lot of training. We spend a lot of time underwater and we go through scenarios where something is going wrong with your partner or going wrong with your gear, whatever it is. You just spend a lot of training and you respond. And then you come up and you debrief and you say, okay, what happened here? One of the things you have to do to get your dive master certification is you have to do a gear exchange with your partner. You literally are going to take off all your gear and you're going to give it to your partner and they're going to take your gear back. My instructor, when he was training us, he stepped it up another level. He threw our gear at the bottom, or threw one set of gear at the bottom of the pool. And he said, okay, both of you are going to go down and you're going to use this gear and one of you is going to suit up. And that means one of us doesn't have air. So we have to share air while we're doing it. So we did a little bit of old school hardcore, more like the Navy training that they do. But that's the way we develop those mental checklists because, again, you're right. There's no time and it's not in the environment you're in. It's not really efficient to have a paper you can pull up. A pilot, yeah, you can pull up, you have them right in front of you. You can, they're available for emergencies. It's right there. There's 2 pilots that are flying the plane usually, or 3 or 4 in a bigger plane. So there's the availability for somebody. Okay, you take over the engine checklist. I'll take over the landing gear checklist, whatever. In diving, you don't have that. And so the way we do it is practice, repetition, debriefing. We recall what happened and talk about it. The next time we'll practice again. Maybe we'll discuss what happened the previous time. It comes back to make it stick, I think, where you ingrain this knowledge through guided practice, way harder than you would ever expect, right? There's no time that I'm going to be underwater without gear. But we did it. So it's way more difficult than it would be in a real situation, but doing that makes you better in that skill. And I think diving is a really good example. I'm so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's interesting. What stuck out to me about diving is I have very distinct memories of being in a situation that's like maybe not actually dangerous, but it's close enough to the real thing where it puts you into that mode. So for me, I was at the bottom of a pretty deep pool once, and the person I was practicing with said, hey, like do a flip, right? They're kind of gesturing to be like, do a flip, it'll be fun. And I did it, and one of my weights popped out of my weight bag, and all of a sudden I'm shooting towards the surface with a lung full of air. And I distinctly remember in that moment hitting my mental checklist, and I was quite young. I was maybe 11 or 12 at the time. And I had this thing in my head of, okay, what's happening is not great. What am I supposed to do? Well, the most important thing right now, I'm shooting to the surface. I need to make sure that my lungs don't pop because they're full of air and the air is expanding. So a way to do that is to just go, which is kind of what you want to do in a scary situation anyway. So that's a nice one. Just scream a little bit. Um, but I was able to recall that. And so kind of a dumb story, but the point of the story is it is very possible to do this even at a young age, to drill something in such a way that you have this really quiet inner voice that says, okay, there's something scary happening right now, and we've prepared for this and we know what to do. Just do the thing. And, oftentimes it's going to be a more complicated thing than just kind of make an noise and get some air out of your lungs. But the point is that that trigger exists and is possible. I think you talked about a lot of good ways to build that. The only nuance that I would really add is that I think you can build it in parts. So, for example, maybe I'm practicing against, that Zerg practice partner, and I just say, hey, just like early pool me or do like weird early game memes, kind of vary it or whatever. I can just be like, all right, the goal is I'm going to make the zealot and then supply block and lose. Fine. The goal is just remember, okay, we're deviating, we're going to make the zealot. And maybe I tell him, hey, every now and then do some like greedy three hatch thing so that I have to like actually be checking, right? I don't get into a rhythm. This is a very dangerous thing where practice partners can turn into mass practice. If I did this with a couple of PvT practice partners recently where they played super duper standard. One of them wouldn't even send a Reaper. And then I got on ladder and somebody sent a Reaper and I just fell apart because I was so conditioned to not expecting it. So having them vary it a little bit and then breaking it into small pieces. So I go, all right, I got the zealot thing. Now let me ratchet the difficulty up because again, I want it to feel hard. I want it to feel difficult to remember all the steps. Okay, now I got to get the zealot in the pylon. Okay, now I got to get the zealot, the pylon, and get some sentries. Or the zealot, the pylon, have a better sim city. Configure my buildings this way. Just adding those little details and layering on nuance.
That's really good points you raised there, and it is interesting when you're thinking about how to integrate this into StarCraft, specifically your PvT example where you have a partner that's practicing with you and it's maybe turning a little bit into mass practice. And I think the big thing that I took away, one of the big things I took away from this book about the checklist is that in the moment in StarCraft, it's really hard to do the checklist if it's new. And I'm going to sneeze maybe, but excuse me. So it's really hard to do it if it's something new that you're thinking about in the moment. And so like somebody sends the Reaper across and you've practiced not really defending the Reaper and all of a sudden you die to it. So I think when we talk about StarCraft and we talk about practice, there's an interesting idea where you want difficult practice, but I think you want low stakes. So doing this in an unranked game, doing this in a, whatever, custom game where losing doesn't really matter, but the practice has to be difficult and varied so you have recall. And I think that's probably what you were missing there is the varied part of the practice. We do this in diving because anybody who's certified in diving probably knows that you first start out in a pool and we're going to run you through in the shallow end of the pool even. And then we start running you through in the deeper end of the pool. And we practice and practice and practice, varying the difficulty, varying the things we practice, recalling them, debriefing, talking about them, having both pre-dive and post-dive debriefs for new students. Eventually, when you get to open water, to the real diving, which is highly supervised, you've had a lot of time to ingrain that knowledge and put it into the self too, where it's going to come naturally. So like when you were rising to the surface, well, you probably had at some point some training some way or another to remember to exhale. It's one of the most important things that diving instructors will teach is never hold your breath while diving. And we just repeat it. And we go through training of, okay, if you're in an emergency ascent, this is what you do. If you're in an uncontrolled ascent, this is what you do. So there's the variability there and the repetition and the recall all coming into play. And for us StarCraft players, you're right. Okay, it's time to practice PvT. I'll call up my, look at this, I'm using like an old phone. How old am I? Call up my hand. I'm doing a pantomime phone. Call up my old friend and say, hey, play me in PvT. Let's do 50 games. And we practice the one build that I'm losing to. And then I go on ladder and they don't do that build that I'm losing to and I lose the game. Well, the practice wasn't very effective. And I almost think I've been trying, kind of toying with this in this past week, of thinking how to improve practice, and all these things that we're coming up on. Maybe your practice partner needs to have a 20-sided die, and literally 20 builds or 10 builds, whatever, and roll the die before the game and say, okay, I'm doing this build, and have the checklist there. Don't make the practice partner have to think too much. Give them the checklist, and they're going to do this build to you. You don't know what build it is, but it's going to come at you, and it's very standardized. So if they hit that build again, it's going to be the same, but there's a variety there. And I think something like that, maybe that's not the best idea, but something like that would improve the way we practice in StarCraft, as we integrate all these concepts: the repetition, the difficulty level, the recall, the analysis of it. I think that's really the way to go.
Yeah, I think so too. The part where I've run into trouble with that is just the sheer amount of time that it takes. So if I need to practice again that one, attack that hits at 5 minutes or whatever it is, if you're telling me I got to get through the first 5 minutes of the game, execute the skill or not, and maybe my opponent will or won't do that build, well, now we've dramatically limited the number of times I can hit it. So it starts to feel really bad, but I still think that you're right. It's really the only way to do it, because if I do anything else, I am just massing practice, or I'm not targeting the skill enough. I'm just hitting ladder, and maybe I don't even queue a Terran. So I think, yeah, I think that has to be the way to go. One thing that I kind of realized maybe I was getting a bit ahead of myself talking about layering in those different reactions in the PVZ example, right? The pylon, the zealot, and so forth. That actually kind of alludes to our next book, which is The Art of Learning. And this one, it's so funny. As I was going through these books, man, I just kept thinking, oh, well, clearly this was the best book that we ever did an archives episode on. And this is one of those that like made my brain do that. And then I go, oh, well, no, some of the other ones are pretty good too. But anyhow, I am a huge fan of this book, Josh Waitzkin, The Art of Learning. The concept that I picked here is what he calls making smaller circles. And this is a process of refining and nuancing your understanding in that way that I was talking about with that PVZ example, but it applies to lots of different things. This could be maybe applied to a scout. So, for example, you go in a Terran space and, there's no barracks there, right? The classic. There's no barracks. Well, what does this mean? If you're in Gold League, it is probably enough for you to be like, my opponent's doing some weird shit. I better play safe, right? That's probably going to be good enough to get you that win in Gold League, to have this very broad strokes. We are not on the standard path. We're over here. And so I'm building batteries. I'm making extra units, production. I might cut workers. I'm making extra supply in case they kill a pylon. You could throw the kitchen sink at them and you'll probably win. When you get up to even Diamond, all of a sudden they're doing weird stuff where it's like, actually, they just made that barracks in the back of their natural, and they're going to play totally normal, dude. And you're flying off the handle, making batteries and cutting workers and whatever. Meanwhile, your opponent has 3 CCs now, and you're over at home like, oh no, I'm scared, man. What's going to happen? So this is another place where making smaller circles can come in, and you go, okay, we are not on the normal path. We're on some other abnormal path, but which one, right? And you really, really do have to layer in and refine that understanding, which is, I think, kind of a different skill set than everything else that we've talked about so far in StarCraft.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I completely agree. Again, like we're like the most agreeable couple here on the internet. Jeez, it's like, yeah, when you see, if you're in Gold League and you see some sort of offshoot of a build that you're expecting, you scout and you do your thing, and it's like, oh, there's no barracks there. Where do I go? Well, yeah, if you just do I'm going to over prepare, you're probably fine, because chances are there's maybe one of two options that it's going to happen, because the play is less sophisticated. But when you start to reach closer to Masters League and the play is a lot more sophisticated and more refined, then it's okay. We've left the standard game, the standard honorable macro game that we all know, and we've now gone down to, Crazy Town or whatever it is, and that has 17 different branches that it can go. And I need to start identifying which of those branches are probably more likely than others and narrowing down, checking behind the natural. Is the barracks there? Is the barracks proxied on their side of the map? Is the barracks proxied on my side of the map? Is it in my base? Which we've seen pro players lose to. And there's obviously no perfect answer to this. It's continual refinement, but it's sort of this improvement of those base skills. And I was thinking of this when I was reviewing the notes in the book, that Josh Waitzkin's book is almost like an expanded version of Inner Game of Tennis, where we're talking a lot about self too and letting go, letting that thinking mind go, we're refining self too through a very natural way of just letting the subconscious take over. That a master's level player, and a lot of people have said things like this in GM or whatever, if you're looking at a really good player like Cyril, when Cyril sees, let's say Cyril plays, I don't know, SOS, a very unorthodox player. Cyril goes into SOS's base, sees weird stuff because it's SOS. Cyril's not thinking like, I wonder what it could be. Cyril is automatically going through the checklist and saying, okay, I need to do X, Y, and Z. I need to scout these areas. I need to check for these different things. Is it a cannon rush? Is it a shield battery rush? Is it a, this, that, and the other? And there's probably hundreds of different pathways that Cyril's automatically, self two is automatically going through and down the line. They're not sitting there thinking about it like we are in diamond level or below, where we're thinking like, okay, make a pylon. I'll scout my third. Yeah, that'll be it. And then, I should go take the tower and make sure I have vision. We're still so much lower level, less sophisticated. And this book is a lot about refining, just refining. And I think, again, if we use the techniques from our other books, or deliberate practice and recall and difficulty, we can improve and sort of smooth out these sort of gaps in our gameplay, especially when it comes to scouting and knowing what's coming at you. I think this book can really directly relate to scouting in StarCraft, because it's sort of knowing how to deal with these situations. And one of the things that I know I'm guilty of is we often think with self one comes up and we start thinking we're better than our opponent. We go in the base and we see that there's no pylon. It's a PvP, Protoss versus Protoss. And we see that we have a pylon, but they don't have a pylon. Those losers, they must have mismacroed, right? And no, actually, it's proxied on your side of the map, and you are going to die in about 3 minutes. And I'm completely guilty of this, where I just think I'm better, and that is the wrong. Obviously, you're losing, and it's sort of, you're losing not because you're bad at StarCraft. You're losing because you're letting self one take over, and your ego is getting in the way, and you're just puffing yourself up. And then you rage because you're like, well, this build bullshit. Like, it should never work. Well, it's really, the reality is that if you had just let self two take over and say, there's no pylon there, I should wait around and see if there's a pylon. If there's not a pylon, it can go down one of 7 paths. And which one are we on? And start refining down.
Yeah, so this is okay. You're saying that we're the most agreeable couple on the internet. I found one where we can argue a tiny bit, barely. Um, so it seems like the argument that you're putting forward is that self one is only destructive in the input that it can have when playing a game of StarCraft. And I think I mostly agree there. I think more often than not, my self one is very panicky, or my self one is incredibly judgmental after the fact. And that especially can hurt as a streamer, right? We all want to be composed. We all want to put on a good show. It can be incredibly feel bad for the audience. I guess there are, audiences that like it, but if you've built yourself up as somebody who's chill and has a good mindset, and then you don't, that's like very damaging for your broadcast. So I agree in those ways. And where I think maybe I differ is that I don't trust that I can build into self 2 enough implicit knowledge to parse my way through that tree of all of the different weird stuff, because somebody could always do something so out there. Like you bring up SOS. If not that I'm ever going to queue SOS, but I fight somebody of that mindset. I've queued Florencia's off races before. You want to talk about going into the freaking Twilight Zone, man.
You might as well just GG right there. It's fine. I'll just
Yeah.
requeue. It's
Yeah, let me
okay.
just, let me get somebody else. You can have it, Flo. Um, yeah, so with that, I think, and this is where I got onto that concept of how do I properly intertwine the handoff of control or the cooperation between selves one and two to be able to have that little bit of an override or a little bit of a quick think and go, okay, this is weird, and I have no real intuitions about it, or maybe I do have a gut feeling, but the gut feeling isn't quite enough, right? It's like, I think it's this or that. And then I need that conscious process to be like, okay, well, can I get coverage of both? Or do I have to just pick one and hope, right? Like, I don't think self two, maybe it can with enough repetition, but I think there's always going to be that first novel scenario that comes up where maybe you do need a little help from self one. I could definitely be argued off at this point, though. What do you think?
Well, I think it's good to have different opinions. Yeah, I probably disagree a little bit, and we can just agree to disagree here. One thing, okay, so I was thinking as you were talking, what would be a positive quality of self one? Because self one is this sort of, um, in my head, it's like the loud voice that's telling me what to do, and but highly critical. Um, I could see this, and it's happened recently with our new situation with DMCA's. Thanks, Twitch. Thanks, Warner Brothers. I don't know who we think, but whatever. I don't know. Making streaming worse in 2020. I have been playing without music, which I have not done ever in StarCraft. I've always had some sort of music going in the background. And because I'm streaming, I feel the need to fill the space. So I talk more about what I'm doing. I've noticed this, at least in the last week or two. And I think that this is a self one thing. I don't think this is a self two thing. And when we go on this, okay, so now we're in a situation that I've never dealt with before. This is a weird build, right? I remember last stream I had a weird build. I'm like, this is really weird. I kept saying that this is really weird. Sometimes for me, I think self one could be useful in then remembering, like saying out loud what I need to do. Okay, now I need to expand. Okay, don't stop making probes. Okay, build this. Boy, probably should check the corners. Is there a hidden base? Things like that, where I'm just sort of, I don't know what to do. Self two has no experience of this, so it's all learning. It's all 100% learning at this stage. There's no experiences I can recall from where this is a very unusual battle cruiser, widow mine, all in at a weird timing that I'm not used to. I think in that case, the SF one probably could be useful, and I think especially because there hasn't been music, and I've been feeling the need to say things to the stream, that actually has come up for me. So maybe I agree a little bit, agree to disagree. On the whole, I think for me, self one is just highly negative, and it's sort of sets me up to be more ragey when I lose than anything else. And so for me, separating from self one is really important. So far that I've gone and said to myself in the mirror, separate yourself from the losses. Don't you're not your MMR, you're not your rank. Right? I've done that before stream so as to calm myself down if I lose and not rage, because once you get angry, like all this stuff goes out the window. There's just no learning at that stage. You're just kind of inflamed with emotion, and it's very hard to continue learning.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm mostly on board with the way that you just kind of nuance your thought process. I think, yeah, the question you posed of like, what's the like redemptive quality of self one, or what is it useful for in game? And I think it is that kind of that logical parsing and thought, or that override. It could also be something like maybe self two gets stuck, right? Maybe my opponent has been doing some kind of, really aggro push, and I'm like, make batteries, make batteries, make batteries, pump units, pump units, pump units. And then the rush ends. And I haven't actually seen anything that would indicate to me that I need to like keep doing that, right? But I'm stuck. My self two is just stuck iterating on its thing. And so I wonder if it's that little like get in, get out. Like, all right, self one, your job is don't be a dick, contribute what you need to, and then get out of the way, right? All you got to do is, okay, self two, here's your cue. We've defended the push. Go back to an eco play now because your opponent has given up and they're macroing, they're droning hard, and you better do it too. And I think maybe this is what I meant when I said it's that like that interweaving, that threading between the two of them where they're helping one another out, because self one can't do that. It can't be like, okay, make probes, make probes, make probes. All right, make a pylon, do this, do that. I've actually had that exact same experience you described where you can almost trick self one into getting out of the way. If you go, all right, buddy, here's your job. We're streaming. So I want you to just say whatever we're doing right now, right? And now what you've done is you've taken self two and you've gone, you're in the driver's seat. All right, self one, just be like a hype man. You're just attached and you're hanging out. You're along for the ride, and you just go. You just cast the game as it's going. What I find is generally I will do that for a while in the game. And if the game goes long enough, if it's a cannon rush, I'll usually narrate all the way through. But if the game goes long enough, I will eventually become quiet and very focused. And that's when, the stream's kind of funny to watch back because your mouth is making weird shapes and stuff as you're freaking out. But it gets self one out of the way, calms it down, and it puts self two in the driver's seat. And maybe this is that thing that I harkened back to at the beginning when we were talking about inner game of tennis of like, what is the like look at the seams on the tennis ball? Where is the the StarCraft fit for that? And I think it might be stream it and narrate what you're doing, which is kind of cool because it forces us to make content.
Yeah, I agree. Streaming is a really interesting way of approaching video games. I probably wouldn't play as much StarCraft if I didn't stream it. I probably wouldn't be as active in StarCraft if I didn't stream it. And yeah, it's really changed the way I approach video games in general and StarCraft in general. And honestly, streaming has led me to meet a lot of cool people in the community. So it is a very different thing, but you do have the unique ability if you do stream to go watch yourself in the moments that you've made mistakes and see what the hell was going on or what were you looking at, where things might have been really obvious on the mini map when you weren't looking, etc. So that is another level of practice that you can do beyond replays, because replays are nice, but it's not the same as like actually seeing where your eyes are on the screen. You can look at yourself and see what's going on. The other thing I was kind of thinking of is that when you are in the game and we're talking about self one and self two, it could be the case that self one is, this sort of external voice or whatever this is. I guess it's internal, but the voice that's telling you what to do. Maybe in the game, it's just not really that possible to use it effectively, or these are really rare cases where you're just completely unfamiliar with what's going on, so you're just trying to manage. And ultimately the win doesn't matter, right? Ultimately what matters is the learning. So after the fact and reviewing and recalling what was happening, what you were thinking, may be just more important overall. And we're sort of talking on the nuance of things. But I still think when we've, kind of wrapping up this book, when we talk about refining the skill set, it definitely does come down to, like making those circles smaller. I think in StarCraft it's a lot of scouting. It's the most applicable way to refine the gameplay, because the more information you have in a game of incomplete information just gives you an edge. That's why map hacking can be one of those things that gives you a huge edge. And there have been people that do it, right? Not many, and not as many as some believe, but there have been people who cheat. And Artosis has said it on his, maybe on a cast or on his stream, that even a map hacker actually has an ability to improve in a way that other players don't, because they have complete information all the time. So they can actually see, maybe certain builds and what they would need to do to respond better, or if you don't look at your replays, more consistently than other players. But let's move on to the next book, I think, because we're sort of running a little bit out of time to finish two more books here. And I think we both want to talk a lot about these two last books.
Yeah, definitely agree. So our next one is what, the talent code?
Talent Code.
Yeah. So my point here is a really interesting one. And this, he actually kind of, it's maybe just a small chapter. This is something he really hits in passing, but it stuck out so much for me in terms of application to StarCraft. So it's this notion of having an average coach, like someone who's like kind of good and maybe just really, really loves whatever the thing is actually better than if I sat Cyril down beside some, Bronze League Zerg and said, "All right, he's the guy. Just, make this bronze player good." And I think that this can definitely apply whether you're, actually like talking to somebody in like a formal coaching scenario, as well as what streamers you watch. I think it's very, very underrated for someone to go into a stream and specifically look for a player who's streaming who's maybe like a full medal above you. Like if you're plat 2, go find a diamond 2 and just watch them. And I did this a ton as I was coming up. I think it may even be one of the reasons why I first met you is I was like, all right, let me like, much as I love the guy, let me stop watching him canning. He's like too good and too fast for me to like really gain a lot, right? He's just like game sensing his way through this puzzle and it's just too much, I can't just watch parting and like learn. I need somebody who's just a little bit better.
Yeah, I think this is a really great point about coaching. The Talent Code has a lot of information about learning and sort of the context of literally building cells in your brain and the myelin, right? The connectors between the neurons. Um, when it comes to high level players, and oh boy, is this community elitist? Because if you are not in the top 1 to 3% of all the players in the world, which is like, roughly speaking, there's like 500,000 players in the world who play actively StarCraft in ranked, give or take, right? This is ballparking it, but whole world. So if you're not in the top 1 to 3% of uh, that mass of people, generally on Twitch or just to learn, people aren't going to watch. They don't want to watch, right? Um, and we know this as streamers because both of us have had streams for a long time. And if you look at growth compared to other games where people just watch for entertainment value, it is very different in StarCraft. Our community is small. It's sort of defensive. It doesn't really welcome people in very much. And it's also kind of elitist when it comes to who you can learn from. And the reality is you can learn from anybody. A good player who's better than you is somebody you can learn from. It doesn't have to be a GM. And one of the risks is a little bit back to the refining your play in these smaller circles is that if you're watching M. Canning, who's an amazing streamer, you should definitely go watch M. Canning, and Parting, another amazing player. A lot of fun, a lot of awesome gameplay you can watch in their streams, really enjoyable. But if we come to this idea of you scout something weird, you as a player, like I as a player, scout something weird, we don't have this, big filing cabinet in our brains of like, okay, here's the 100 different things it can be, and I can already cross out 75 of them because I know there's some nuance about the timing. It's at 12 seconds, not 17 seconds. So boom, all those are gone. Whereas M. Canning and Parting, probably even more so Parting because he's such a high level, right? Arguably right now he's in the top 7, 8 players in the world of StarCraft, and he doesn't need to go through and start thinking about these other builds because it's just not possible. Vibe is a really good example, I think, of this kind of coaching. Vibe is extremely good, top level GM with all 3 races, pro player in the past, is now actually kind of dabbling a little bit again with playing tournaments. And in PvP, I've learned a tremendous amount from watching Vibe, where Vibe will talk about, okay, what does the opponent have? that can tell you where the money has been spent. Is there a sentry coming out? Is there this? Did you see a hallucination from a sentry, which means there has to be a sentry out? That means this much gas has been taken. If you can kind of parse out a lot of information from the scouting. And this is a sort of like refinement of, okay, I don't have to worry about DTs because I know where the gas went. Now, you don't need to go to a coach that's GM to learn that. You can learn how to defend a 12 pool from me, right? If you're a platinum player, I can teach you how to defend a 12 pool in Diamond 1. Easy, right? But most people will see a Diamond 1 player or a Masters 3 player and they're like, yeah, but they make so many other mistakes. I don't want to learn from them. I don't want to learn these bad mistakes. And it's really incorrect thinking is that you can learn from somebody just a little bit above you. And when it comes to pro players, that's actually all they got, right? They play amongst themselves, and the only people they can train with, it's not like some magical omnipotent, player exists where they just go. I mean, maybe Mario, right? But like you just there's nobody when you're at that top level, you're all kind of the same. So you have to train with each other and learn together. And maybe somebody is very slightly better at you at one build. Well, that's who you're going to train with. So the pro players do it. The pro players know it. The top level know it. But the community as a whole, they treat it like, oh boy, if I'm in silver, I can only learn from a GM. Well, that's silly. You can certainly learn from a platinum player a lot, actually, because their macro is pretty decent, especially these days compared to early StarCraft 2. A platinum player, they're taking 4 bases, they're saturating their bases. Like, whoa, this is huge compared to a silver player who maybe thinks that some build is broken. Well, the reality is if your macro was better, the build wouldn't feel broken. But if you're only looking at M canning and M canning is playing with disruptors and you think, well, that's the way I have to beat this build is with disruptors, well, you're really getting the wrong sense of the game. So I think it comes down to sort of, identifying somebody that's better than you. And I agree 100% here. When you want to learn from somebody else, whether it's a coach or just watching VODs, you don't necessarily need the top level player. And in some ways, because we kind of get our egos involved, it can be pretty detrimental to how you learn.
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think when you, I think not only is it true what you're saying that you don't need to learn from the very, very best, I think it is actively worse if you try to. And the reason for that is essentially what you're doing when you watch a stream of someone better than you for the express purpose of trying to learn is you're trying to sort of do subtraction, right? You're trying to go, what is the difference between what this person did and what I'm doing, right? Well, if I watch parting, that difference is a heck of a lot. And I don't know, like half of it or something is literally how he's moving his units. And I may not even have, back to our last concept, making smaller circles, I may not have circles that are small enough to even capture and accurately state the difference between what he did and what I did. I'm like, I don't know, he's doing shit with stalkers and a prism and like 1 sentry for some reason. Like, dude, what do you want me to do? I can flail at that a little bit, but it's not going to look like whatever he did. So I think by having that really large difference between what the streamer did and what you did, you make it very convoluted. Because what I'm really trying to figure out, if I'm in high silver and I can't beat a Terran, is what do I need to do to be in low gold and not beat a Terran, right? Like, I want to be losing to people who are slightly better, right? And if I look at what Parting is doing to play against a Terran in, GM, well, sure, there's lots of stuff that I'm not working on, but which ones are the important ones, right? This is a real example, by the way. This is what I was referencing earlier when I said, I think I met Adraseth by hanging out in his stream trying to learn some stuff. And I remember being in high silver, coming in like, yeah, man, shit, I just can't figure out. Back then as now, PVT, can't figure it out, man. I don't know what to do. And he goes, well, do you make splash at all? Like, are you getting storm? Because I remember when I was that MMR, Terrans didn't know what ghosts were, dude. And you could just storm them for free. So maybe try that. And I was like, I don't know. Feels kind of scary. Like, not sure that I actually want to do that. I gotta like have another control group. I have to like actively like hit a button and then aim a spell. It feels a little spooky to me. Like I'm only silver. And he's like, just try it one game, whatever. And immediately I shoot up to Gold League off of Andrew's advice, right? I'm like, this guy's my new best friend. We're gonna hang out forever. Um, so kind of funny, right? But like, I'm not gonna get that from parting because he doesn't remember what it's like to be Silver League, right? He didn't do that at all recently. And even though he knows a lot about what's important to do in PvT, he doesn't know what the very next step is that I need to take as a Silver League player. I think it's interesting because, as you say, the pros recognize that we need to learn from each other. It's all they can do. I think other streamers recognize this too because while viewership can be often very hostile to a smaller streamer, the other streamers aren't, right? We are, one of the things we do, I think, better than anybody in this community is raid and host down instead of up to that smaller person who's like clearly trying and working to build, a cool stream. I've gotten so much help from people. And if we had that at the pro level or at the streamer level, that just wouldn't happen. So I really think it's about viewership, and I think people do cheat themselves by only wanting to watch that, cream of the crop tier stream.
Oh man, so many good points you just raised. It's a very nice compliment too. I think if you compliment me anymore, my head might not fit in the webcam. It'll just get too big and it'll be clipping all over the place. But to come back to Parting, who's a great example, I think. He's Arid is expanding my webcam, so my head does clip. To come back to Parting, something I remember Artosis saying when his return, because he spent time away from StarCraft and he returned. He was world champion, and during the time of the Soul Train, and it was the build that he would do so well. And Artosis would say, watching him in his first season back about the GSL, I believe he was saying, well, Parting was really good and he was champion. But when people tried to replicate what Parting was doing during that time, they just didn't do it as well. He was just so good at doing it, and it worked really well. And I think this comes to the idea of watching some high level and like you're saying, trying to do what they're doing can be really detrimental, like playing with disruptors. I remember in 2017-ish, I was watching a lot of Zest because Zest he was hot. He was doing great, right? And I thought, well, if I play PvP like Zest, or if I played in general like Zest, I'll win a lot of games. The thing that happened is that Zest would do things and take risks which he knew he could pull off. And building just the right number of units to defend, or just the right number of units to attack, is really important. And I actually recall a specific classic argument between Adraseth and H-Jax, because I love arguing with H-Jax, about defending certain types of Terran attacks. And I had put down cannons, and H-Jax said, well, that's very expensive. Why did you put down cannons? And I said, well, I'm not good enough to just have units that roam back and forth and defend against these different points. So therefore, I felt like I needed cannons. Now, what was interesting about that point is what I was saying I felt was very true. But H-Jax identified something that I could work on. Maybe not building those cannons and actually just focusing on defending without cannons, defending with units. I eventually did get better because I did focus on that one aspect, which at the time I would have played off of, well, you have to have cannons. I'm only this good. And similarly, your story about Storm, where silver players probably don't need to be making Storm. It's actually kind of hard to control. However, it's more difficult than what you're doing. And it's going to teach you to do something that you're kind of scared to do. And it comes back to making it stick. It's something that actually is going to improve your learning efficiency over time, even though it's probably not great for lower level players to be focusing on such high end units, because they're difficult. And again, coming back a little bit to Vibes, he's done a bunch of these bronze GM, like every season he's doing a bronze GM run. And I remember him not using Storm all the way up to Masters. And I thought, what? Like, I always have Storm. And he said, you don't need it. You don't need it. It's too complicated. And I was like, what? I started playing a little bit without Storm, seeing how that would work, focusing on other aspects of my game that were weaker. And it did help. So I think that there is this definite like coaching. A good coach and a coach that really understands this will sort of push you in the right direction gently. And they don't have to be that much better than you. They can just give a few suggestions, but they'll identify something that's difficult that you can practice. kind of steer you away from any bad habits and allow you to grow as a player in a way that you probably couldn't, because it's hard for you to self-identify your mistakes, probably because of the self-one ego thing that we have going on. And additionally, they have more experience, so they can look at things that are like, ooh, this is actually really a problem. You may not think it's a problem, but being supply blocked for that long is an issue that needs to be solved. So it's an interesting idea of how coaching works, and I think your examples are really good there to how learning takes place when you're watching other players.
Yeah, I think that's a really really interesting topic, and I think probably is the source of most tension between a coach and a student, because it does go the other way a bit at times. So in your example, right, where you're taking these cannons, you're thinking, gosh, I really don't have what I need. I don't have the tools or the skill set or ability as a player to manage, my defense being mobile and having to run between all these spaces. So I'm just going to do the cannon thing. You are right as the student that you don't have the skill set, and the coach is right that at higher levels it will not work. And so the question is this a way to introduce desirable difficulty, harkening back to one of our last books, or is it actually right for you to have this crutch because the most important thing for you to be working on is something else entirely? And if I have you work on this, all you're going to do is stumble on this and not even set yourself up to learn the thing that you really should be focusing on. And I don't think that there are any easy answers or cheats here to figure out which of those universes you're in, right? Is the coach right that this is the most important thing, or is the student right that, you know, I'm going to acknowledge this is a crutch. I'm going to know that I am taking a loan, right? I'm accruing some debt here that I'm going to have to fix later, and I will have to struggle to like not have the cannons for my defense or whatever it is. But I'm doing that very intentionally, very specifically to create room for something else that I'm working on. And I think, maybe this is just the amount of like sort of synchronization that you have with a coach, like how well the two of you mesh to where you can figure out who's right in a given moment. Maybe it just is a matter of, a really smart student or a really good coach being able to see their way through. I don't think there are good answers, but I think it's important to be aware of the dynamic, because it's kind of this funny game of chicken, right? Where if you think you're right, you should stand your ground, but you also kind of got to be open to the other person being right, because you both the goal is the same. We want to make the student better. And if you just always yield to the other person, you're not getting it right 100% of the time.
Right. Yeah. And this it's a tricky thing. I think that balancing act is really difficult. And there's a lot of people who offer coaching in the StarCraft scene, and it's tough. I would say that if anybody's looking for coaching, they would probably need to do a little bit of shopping, because it is money, right? You are paying money to these folks to coach you. Do a little bit of shopping around and seeing whose personality you mesh with the best, and not just, oh, I have to be coached by, Parting, because Parting's the best person in the world as in a player. Maybe they're not the best coach for you. So it does take a little bit of work, and even I know Eric has two coaches or more actually. So there's different types of coaching you can get, and it's completely okay to have a coach that just coaches you for one thing, I think. So uh, I think we've covered that book pretty well. If we're ready to move on to the next book, maybe
Yeah, I think
Thinking in
so.
Bets.
The last thing that I wanted to add there is book 4. Jumping back a little bit. Josh Waitzkin actually addresses this exact point of finding a coach who will not stifle you as a student, and how it is very possible to have a very smart coach who just does not mesh with you, and that's something that you need to be aware of as a student. And it doesn't reflect badly in any way on the coach or you as a student. It is literally, it's like a romantic relationship almost, right? It's a chemistry thing. It's like there's nothing wrong with person A or B. They're just not like a match in that way. And he kind of talks about examples in the book of coaches who didn't mesh with him as well. But yeah, our last book here for the day. welcome in to everybody who just came in from the raid. We're doing a recap, kind of greatest hits of the archives, episode 1 through 6. What are our favorite concepts, and re-examining things that we didn't consider as we hit these books for the first time. So, book 6, Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets, really, really great book. Again, I think of these books, I'm like, oh gosh, clearly this one's the favorite, right? My pick here for a really, really big, important concept is actually a quote. She says, "Our goal is to get our reflexive minds to execute on our deliberative minds' best intentions." And I heard this and my brain exploded because I'm like, oh my God, it's book 1. This is self 1, self 2. So clear as day to me. We have our deliberative mind, our self 1, trying to get our reflexive mind, self 2, to do the right thing in the moment in a high pressure situation, which makes me think back to Checklist Manifesto. Like, this book tied so much together for me. How do we, under pressure, with limited time, with our adrenaline pumping, get our reflexive mind to do the stuff? And I think that the difficulty that exists in achieving that is the reason why self 1 is such a dick to self 2 all the time and gets so mad and goes, why can't you just do it? And self 2 is like, but it's hard. I was under a lot of pressure. There was adrenaline coursing through me and I didn't have much time.
Yeah, this is again, we've been hammering this home throughout all these books. This idea of getting this sort of external knowledge that you might know internally. So, I hate the term muscle memory, but that's sort of the term that's commonly thrown around. It's, it's this reflexive play, this knowing what to do in the right moment without having self 1 telling you what to do. And it takes deliberate practice. I think this is what we've found through all these books that we've so far gone over, is that it really comes back to you do have to isolate certain things and practice them at a difficulty more difficult than you really need, as well as integrating variety and recall, refinement. All of these concepts come together in this sort of last book that we did, Thinking in Bets, where to get better in the moment when the pressure's on and the stakes are high, and poker players have it much higher than us where there's money on the line, you can't be making those decisions for the first time in the game. Or you can, I guess you could try, but it's not really great for your outcomes. And so you have to sort of develop this through your practice and through with your coach, with your deliberate practice, with the way that you're learning through time, so that when the stakes are high, it's not a conscious decision. It's a self 2 decision that's just boom, oh, I know what to do, right? Just like we said, canning or parting, they may scout something weird and they can pretty quickly start eliminating all the possibilities that are not realistic and identify the ones that are realistic. But they're not doing that consciously. They're doing it subconsciously. And that's really what this book talks quite a bit about, as well as tying into those other books about when you have incomplete information in a game, how do you get to that point? Because StarCraft, like poker, is a game of incomplete information, unlike chess, which we talk about occasionally, where you can see everything on the board. You know exactly what's going on. And there's a lot more memorization of opening moves and sort of what to do in this situation, what to do in that situation. Whereas StarCraft's like, well, Florencio has made a career of weird builds, so weird that they show up in the GSL in the top level play of the community. Florencio's builds will show up there because they're just so strange, and like nobody is thinking in the way, there's a few people, I can't say nobody, but there are a few people I think that way. And that's really cool. But if you're trying to figure out how to defend that build on the ladder for the first time and self 1 is taking over, boy, it's probably going to end up in a loss for you.
Yeah. I gotta derail us for a quick second. And I know this is a long episode, and I'm sorry to all the listeners out there, but boy, did they do Florencio dirty on the GSL that day, because they said, I think Artosis was the one who said it. The quote was, "Not even the most deranged minds on the NA ladder could think of a build like this." And I almost threw the remote at the TV, man, because I'm like, okay, you literally just described Florencio right? The most deranged mind on the NA ladder. And then you said he can't think of it. It's his build, man. They did our boy
Yeah.
dirty. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Justice for Florencio.
yeah, for sure.
Start tweeting at Artosis right now.
But I digress. I think what is really interesting here, especially with the poker example, is that it is theoretically possible for them to sit there and crunch the numbers every hand, right? And if you're some kind of savant, I guess maybe you could play the game that way. I actually, when there was that big like poker phase that the world went through where it was like everybody cared about it all of a sudden, I kind of got swept up in that a little bit in high school, and like, was kind of trying to study it and learn and, play against friends for, small like penny stakes and that kind of thing, but like taking it seriously as a competitor. And I really bought into that. I genuinely thought, oh, this is the way that these, poker professionals are doing it. They're actually like computing the statistics on the fly. And I think part of that is that the overlays on those casts would like show you the percentages, right? So I'm thinking, oh, they're all like doing competitive math and that's all this is. And it really isn't that, right? And Annie says it in the book. It's more about building that stuff into your intuition so that you go, yeah, okay, like whatever. Ostensibly, this is based in math, and maybe I studied the math at a point, but I kind of just know, like, I see my cards, I see the common cards, and I see the player's behavior, and I can intuit from that whether this is a high or low percentage play for me to stay in the hand or bet or whatever. You can kind of process it that way. And she talks about this specifically, right? That like you could sit there and try to do the math, but eventually you're going to piss the whole table off and get, called for slow play enough times that you kind of get laughed out of the room. So it is very applicable, I think, the poker example. Like we can draw a lot of parallels to StarCraft because again, like there is incomplete information and you don't have a lot of time, so you must intuit these things.
Right. Yeah. And I think this is why it's pretty common for StarCraft pros, or it used to be kind of common for StarCraft pros to cross over into poker. Online poker has been sort of regulated highly over the last 10 years. So things have changed, but it was pretty common for StarCraft pros to either supplement their income or go completely over to poker. I know like pretty popular caster, Todd, the French caster. He's gone over and played poker and played it at a very high level and made money with it. So it is pretty common, and I think it is like you're saying because the concepts from poker mesh very well with the brain development and the way of thinking in StarCraft, where it's an incomplete information game. And yeah, you can do math, right? You can start doing math in the game if you were really quick with math and had enough information, but it's not really the best way to play. And thinking of the game in this sort of more like a chess fashion of black and white, you sort of have, you can do the math because chess players do the math, like literally are doing the math when they're calculating moves and calculating where, one point might be taken for a pawn or not. We don't really need to do that in StarCraft. And in fact, it's going to probably hinder your development more than help your development. And this is a concept that when I read the book, I hadn't really thought of. Maybe I knew a little bit of it when I considered it, but since I never played poker, I'd never thought about it in the terms of poker. And it really has changed my perspective on playing StarCraft as, no, it's not like chess, which is what everybody used to say when they described it back in the Wings of Liberty days, because we were big on Justin TV or Ustream or these websites that don't exist anymore. We were big on the first streaming platforms, and we were sort of this big esport that was the first one that was majorly streamed, and new players would constantly be talking about it as, oh, it's kind of like chess, right? And I remember an interview with Idra, however you want to say it, where they asked them, it was like for, sort of somebody that's not in the scene was asking this high level player about StarCraft. It's like, oh, it's like chess. And he said, no, it's not at all like chess. And it's correct because it isn't like chess. Chess is very different. It is logical. We can give you that, but that's pretty much where the similarities end, because StarCraft has all these other components, especially this lack of information and lack of knowledge. So therefore, you're going to have to sort of hedge your bets on what is the best move at the time given that information. And when we come back to criticizing yourself a little bit, you may lose a game. This is another one of those Artosis quotes is like, you don't necessarily have to be right. You have to be decisive to win games.
Yep.
And sometimes you're going to lose a game, even if you chose the right move. And sometimes you're going to win the game, even when you didn't choose the right move because you were decisive. And that's just the charm, if you will, about StarCraft.
Yeah, I think we get really hung up on the fact that they're both strategy games, right? Because you're right, that's sort of where the similarities end. And I think, again, we all have the ego piece where, like, I want to be like the strategic mastermind, right? This is where the whole notion, the whole meme of the honorable macro player comes from, right? That if I win my games because I let the game go long and I steer the game as a slow turning ship towards victory, right? I navigate all of these hazards or whatever, that I am somehow like, I can puff myself up. I'm just this mastermind, right? And I think, shout out to Printf dropping the raid here. We really do not give enough respect to the control, the decisive action, all of these kinds of things where, it's like we don't really need to prove it, right? There's a whole Illuminati full of players who only play this way, and they get quite high MMR, right? We've got numerous GMs talking in chat right now about, these concepts. They all got their cannon rushing, um I think it's very tempting to assign a lot of the success to that self one concept, and this is where the, I'm such a genius. But the game is so much more than that, and I think being able to put more value on intuition, on a player's ability to decisively flow with the game, and just, manifest the correct intuition, not question it, not pause. You were speaking earlier about the filing cabinet, right? And the good players will rifle through it and be like, all right, I've got 95 options for what this could be. It's definitely not any of those 75. Let's just throw them right out. I think um I guess that's really the difference, right? Is you and I will sit there, we'll examine all 95 of those options, and before we know it, I'm floating 3,000 minerals, and I haven't acted decisively at all, and I'm just dead no matter what I pick. So it would have been better to pick one at random and just kind of go. And I think we often don't mentally criticize or punish that enough because of this latching on to the strategic mastermind archetype.
Right. And I think this comes back to a lot of the way that StarCraft has been portrayed in learning over the years, where there's been a tremendous amount of emphasis on mechanics and a lack of emphasis on decision making over the years. Maybe that's starting to turn around these days, but I haven't played Brood War in a while, but I used to stream Brood War last year, and I would get people coming in the Brood War community. Oh, how I love you! You're so special. The Brood War community will show up and they'll say, "Oh, really? To be really good, you need higher APM." And you look at people like Printf who got Masters League. Admittedly, it's StarCraft 2, and it is a different game with a keyboard. So, APM is kind of irrelevant to some of these conversations. Although in the lower leagues, like we talked about, when you build up that foundation, you do need to develop some fundamentals, right? There needs to be some fundamental rhythm to making workers and not getting supply blocked. So there is some mechanical skill. But boy, do we really emphasize, like, okay, you really need to learn Blink Micro right now. It's like, nah, you don't need to learn Blink Micro. Like, are you kidding me? And I think this comes back to one of the closing thoughts I wanted to have for this book, and a bit of the sort of the series of review that we did here, is that for coaches, it's it's really important for coaches to recognize this in terms of how to train their disciples or their students in good decision making, and the most effective way for the students to learn by designing sort of challenges for them, and kind of guiding their learning experience along a path. um, so many times we see coaches, you know, advocating something like mass practice, which isn't good. We know they maybe will do like replay analysis where they'll be like, oh, you did this, you did this, you did this, you did this wrong. When really it's almost like ineffective after you've identified 25 things that the player did wrong. Like, well, yeah, you know that those are 25 things, but how are they going to take that knowledge of the 25 things they did wrong and implement it into a game? Rather than maybe focus on some major decisions or how decisions are made within StarCraft. Because I think as we can see from the way that other players have easily navigated to a high level of play, um, decision making is highly important, probably more important than most other aspects of the game. Again, you do have to have those foundational base skills of, you cannot like not build production. For example, you can't just float 5,000 minerals and still win at a high level. You do need to have some of the basic stuff, but and I think this is like, the crew, like the Florencio crew of people who, Florencio beats GMs with his builds, right? And they're used in like, GSL. And I would say, and Florencio probably agrees, macro is not the best, but there are some interesting decision making choices that he just knows because of all of his experience. And I've had Florencio look at some of my replays, and you'll say, yeah, when this happens, this is the types of responses the player could have. So you need to be prepared for those types of responses, which is very interesting. Somebody like Printf, or I know F equals MA is in the chat, and Grim Reaper, there's so many players that play in this kind of unorthodox style. Their game knowledge depth is so deep because they understand in every situation what is the likely outcome. And they maybe are the other extreme of the average player who practices macro all the time. They're on the extreme of decision making all the time. And you can play Star with the beauty of StarCraft, you can play it any way you want. But a coach who's coaching some player really, I would hope, if they hear this, takes this knowledge to heart of designing an effective learning strategy for their student so that they can, one, tailor it to what the student needs to know, but also challenge them in the right ways so that they're getting the best value for their money, because they're paying for these things, that they actually, use these sort of learning concepts in teaching their students.
Yeah, very well said. I don't even think I don't think there's anything for me to add there. Do you have any more points you want to hit on this, or should we jump to Q&A?
I'm fine here. I think that I've talked enough about these concepts, and boy, it was really fun to go back through these books. So if we have some Q&A from the chat, go ahead. And Low Cranial is kind of tabulating any Q&A. Hopefully, if there has been Q&A, it hasn't been missed. So we will answer any questions you have now.
Yeah, so jumping into the first one, we've got something from Grimmy here, Grim Reaper, and he sort of pointed out um, that, going back to the is it or isn't it chess analogy, right? That you could, in a way, consider the timing of a given, set of structures or given build or a given amount of units, say, as a position in chess. This is I guess aligns really well that he would make this argument after what you just said about how, players like Grimmy do kind of play more in this space of, being very decisive and having a very strong intuitive understanding of the game. I think most likely because, one, they're playing a bit off meta, and two, they get to force the game to look a certain way, right? Whereas the longer a game goes, the more weird branches we can kind of hit, right? But if I say I'm going to be building things in your base at, a minute or two into the game, whether you like it or not, right? The number of branches we're looking at is much smaller. So to Grimmy's point here, um, I think it's an interesting. I guess this is more of a comment or observation than a question, but to add some commentary to it, I think it's possible that he's right. Um, when I consider Terran playing standard, and which was his example, right? I see, a 2-1-1 build off the Terran. I can intuit that there's going to be some kind of, push 5 minutes. It's going to look one of a couple of ways. I can maybe intuit it even a little bit further based on other things that I've seen. When did they take their gases? What units have I scouted off the factory, etc. I do think it's possible, and I think I'm also still a little bit on Team Annie Duke here, where um, I think a lot of times I want my intuition to be driving this rather than my conscious brain trying to be that mastermind.
That's a good point. I think also one thing to consider as well, especially we should come up with a term for this kind of play. And people would say it's cheesy. I don't think that's a really good term for it, but this is like the printf, F equals MA, Florencio, all you folks that play like that, Haas, there's so many of you that play like that. And it's very interesting and valid and really frustrating to play against, but still, hey, it's a fun game. So let's go for it. Um, when those games occur, a lot of times, they don't go super long. They're not these ultra late games where every base is taken on the map like you might see in the GSL. So, in my opinion, in StarCraft, the decision making earlier that you go in the game, the number of branches that you can go off in your decision making is fewer. The other side of that is that those players have a pretty significant amount of information when they've trapped another player on one base, because they have less to scout and more vision of that base. That's not to be said. Like, I know all of those guys, any of those players can continue on and play, more macro oriented and have more bases and have bigger games. Well, when everything's more spread out on the board, so to speak, there's more to scout, and so there's more chance for missing information. So I think the decision making becomes a little bit more tricky as the game progresses because of that.
Yeah, I definitely agree. A couple other points that are maybe worth hitting that Grimmy brought up along with this. Genies is a good example at 100 APM and 6K MMR on EU, which for those who maybe aren't as well versed with like what does that MMR mean, that is a nice strong GM amount of MMR. Um, and also Tricky Dano, another good example of somebody just kind of intuiting their way through a game really, really well. And an interesting thing there specifically about Dan is like um he doesn't have the rules like Printf does, right? He doesn't have a never expand emote in his chat. He's willing to be like, yeah, okay. I got to lead off this cannon rush, and my highest value play here is I'm just gonna like take two bases while you're stuck, right? Have fun navigating your way through this game now, buddy. And I think that that's really interesting. Now, not to do Printf dirty here. He has said, in tournament play, he will kind of take the weights off the bat, as it were, to go back to that example, and really swing on some people. But it's I do think it's a really interesting thing, and yeah, the community needs a term for this type of play. I really don't think that we have one. We don't have, even as we're talking about it, a concrete enough definition. I think we both know the concept that we're talking about, but I don't think we've pinned down the definition enough, and we certainly don't have a term where everybody can kind of, agree to disagree like we do with timing or all in or anything else.
Well, we could we should brainstorm a little bit, but I think Florencio's build, where a nexus is built inside your base, is called the friendship build, and maybe we could call it the friendship style of play. Um, Greamy had another question that kind of followed up. Did any of the books cover sleep's role in learning? And I don't recall seeing that in any of the books, but I think from sleep science, and I'm going to guess Eric probably has a better grasp of this field than I do. It's extremely important to brain development and function on the whole. So getting a good night's rest is really important. So if you're not getting good sleep, not only are you damaging at a cellular level in your body, you're damaging yourself, but you also shorten your lifespan if you don't realize that. If you're not getting 7 to 8 hours of sleep as an adult, you can lose years on the end of your life. So do try to get good sleep and try different methods to improve your sleep, like not looking at screens late at night, turning down the lights, those sort of things. It's really important.
Yeah, definitely. Gosh, like what an awful way to shorten your life, right? Like if you're gonna do it, there are many more fun ways. You can drink too much coffee, you can eat bad foods. There's all kinds of stuff you could do. Um, yeah, excellent point, Grimmy. I almost wonder, maybe this could be a future episode of the archives. Maybe, do we Grimmy's got a nice accent. We could have you on the show. That definitely boosts the ratings for sure. Let's think on
Yeah.
this, and maybe we can find a good book, or even, I'd be open to summarizing other sources. We could look at scholarly articles, or anything like that. Maybe there's literature published by researchers or something like that that's more uh like prose, right?
Yeah, that would be an interesting topic to cover, is the effects of sleep and learning in StarCraft. And a lot of us gamers, if you're a true gamer, you stay up pretty late. You got that DGen time schedule. So it would be an interesting topic to cover for sure.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, now that we've teased the audience about future episodes, I do think it's a great time to hype it up. I'm not gonna let the cat out of the bag just yet, but I will say we are in discussion with some very exciting guests. One in particular, we're looking at doing something potentially for next month if the timing lines up. Um, and and I'm very excited about it. I think it's going to make for some excellent content. I will share a bit ahead of time. As you've probably heard, if you follow the archives, we are taking some feedback, and responding to it from the viewers and listeners, that a lot of folks don't necessarily have the time to read these books, but they're very interested in the content. And so reshaping sort of the idea of the book club to, like, Adreseth and Aret read this for you so you don't have to, and kind of give you the mapping to StarCraft, and then we all have a talk about the concepts, versus everybody go read the book and then we'll have, a discussion from there. So that's what you can look forward to for forthcoming episodes. Yeah, I guess from there, anything you have to say, Adreseth, or we can do shout outs.
Yeah, we can move on to shout outs. I'll just say a few things that are important for us. If you do like the content that we're making, we do this all free, and we're paying out of pocket to do this content at the best quality that we can. And we do have a Patreon set up. Maybe Aret. I think Aret set this up. If not, we'll set one up that if you want to contribute a small amount, you could do that through Patreon. Also, it does help us. We do look at the statistics of people that listen to the podcast version of this versus the live Twitch stream. If you are listening on the podcast, do us a favor and give us a little rating. It's take a few seconds, but it does help us be found by other players of StarCraft who like the content that we're creating, so that we can get the word out to more people, because we just would love to discuss StarCraft, and we like to have more input from the viewers and listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. As far as Patreon, I'm a horrible streamer because I do think I made it. I don't have the link handy. I will get on top of that. Next time I'll have like a nice command or something, everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll post that in Discord if anybody is really, hungering to jump on that this month. But we do plan on getting back to that once a month schedule, and yeah, just really, really excited about the different things we have coming, the people that we're working with. We are very much open to book suggestions, topic suggestions, and hey, participate in that Q&A. Grimmy might have gotten himself on the show today by asking a good question. So it's very much something we're open to. And I guess that's a wrap for us, huh?
I want to one last thing, and then I will shut up and we can call it a day. I do want to acknowledge Lord Cranial. It's mod in chat. You see him there. He's been very generous in giving his time to do a little bit of production work with us. So it's really helpful to have somebody do that, as it's hard for us to have this conversation, look at our notes, also moderate chat, keep track of the questions. So we appreciate Lord Cranial joining the team here and doing a little bit of work for us. And if you saw in chat, there was a bunch of links to all sorts of social media platforms as well as YouTube that you can follow, and do click on those and follow them if you like this content.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't believe I almost did that to you, Lord Cranial. Big apologies. Yeah, I mean, we really would not be able to do this without the help. Certainly, it's way too hard to run production, look at notes, try to be somewhat interesting and conversation here. So really appreciate him, and he does stream quite a bit. So give him a look. He's a really cool, thoughtful dude. And we appreciate him a whole heck of a lot.
With
Well,
that, thanks everybody for watching.
yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm gonna drop a raid here. I was entertaining the idea of laddering a bit after this, but I think my brain is just a little bit too cooked. 6 books was a lot of concepts to go through. So thank you once again, everybody who tuned in live. Thank you, everybody listening out there in podcast land or YouTube VOD land. And we'll be announcing in my Discord and on Twitter that next episode coming up sometime in July.
Thanks everybody.
Alrighty. Have a good one. Dropping the raid in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, go hype up Orok. He's a good guy. Not actually clear yet. Not clear yet. Hold, please. Hold, please.